One of the key characteristics of life, of living organisms, is that they reproduce. They make more of themselves for future generations. And there are two main categories of reproduction. Asexual reproduction, where you create an identical copy of yourself by one of several mechanisms, and sexual reproduction, where you combine your genes with another individual of your species and you produce an offspring or multiple offspring that are some combination of your genes and the other individual's genes. There are different ways to go about sexual reproduction, but they all involve gametes. Sperm being what we consider a male gamete, and egg being what we consider a female gamete, and they come together to form a single diploid cell called a zygote. The simplest kind of asexual reproduction is just fission. It means you have a parent organism, a cell or multicellular organism, and it just cuts itself off in the middle and becomes two new organisms that will both grow, and they're genetically identical. But a lot of organisms reproduce by budding, which is an asexual reproductive technique where a new individual grows off of the old individual. So if a new mark grew off of my shoulder and eventually would fall off and become a separate mark, genetically identical to this original mark, that would be budding. And organisms like hydras do that. Fragmentation is similar. You break body pieces off and those develop into adults. A lot of plants do this, right? You can take a cutting of a plant and you can put it in the ground, and very often it will grow into a new adult plant with the exact same DNA as the parent plant. And parthenogenesis is something that we see in a number of organisms, including and especially rotifers, which we talked about. This is where females lay an egg that's not haploid. It's diploid instead, and the new individual grows from the egg. Now, usually there's some shuffling of the genes, but it's shuffling of the mom's genes, right? There is no introduction of genes from a male where you can mix them up and shuffle them. Instead, mom just creates an egg, but it remains diploid, and that egg then grows into an adult organism. And sexual reproduction does not seem like a good idea, right? For a couple of reasons. One, there's this thing called the twofold cost of sexual reproduction that we'll talk about in a moment. And two, you have to find a mate, and that can be difficult. And three, if your genes are good, why would you only want half of your genes to be in your offspring? Why wouldn't you want all of your genes to be in your offspring? Right? You're successful, you created offspring, clearly you want your offspring to be successful too. Why in the world would any organism reproduce sexually? And yet, almost all eukaryotic species do. When I talk about the twofold cost of sexual reproduction, this is what I'm talking about. If you are an individual and you have a fixed number of offspring, so you're a female having offspring, let's say your fixed number is 2. Could be anything, but 2 makes the math easy. If you are reproducing asexually, both of your offspring will be female, and they then will both be able to have offspring themselves, 2, and then their offspring can each have 2, and you grow quickly. In sexual reproduction, if you have 2 offspring as a female, half of them are going to be male. So let's say one of them is female. The male can't have its own offspring. The female is the only one who can gestate and reproduce, so she produces 2 offspring. Again, half of them are male. That female produces 2 offspring, half of them are male. Essentially, you're only able to produce half as many offspring for the same number of organisms in sexual reproduction, and you get twice as many in asexual reproduction. That's the twofold cost that we're talking about, twofold more offspring over here. So why in the world would any organism evolve sexual reproduction? And the answer is there are some advantages, the biggest one being an increase in the genetic variation of your offspring. If the world is unchanging, then yes, it makes sense that if you were very successful in your environment, your genes made you very successful at reproducing, then you'd want your offspring to have only your genes, and they would also then be very good at reproducing, and you would avoid this twofold cost of sexual reproduction. But in a changing environment, in a dynamic environment, your genes, while good in this generation, may not necessarily be good in the next generation or in the generation after that. And so it's nice to hedge your bets. Sexual reproduction is all about hedging your bets. and you have offspring that are different from one another in a number of ways. So let's say you are very, very good at growing, but you use a lot of water to grow, right? In a very wet environment, that's great. You got plenty of water available. You're going to outgrow your competition and you're going to reproduce more effectively. But let's say that over time, your environment gets drier. Well, then all of a sudden, you're going to be at a big disadvantage. But if your offspring vary, some of them might do better in that drier environment, and thus your genes carry on. And this isn't just a logical hypothesis. There are studies that support this. There are organisms that can reproduce sexually and asexually. And if you grow them in a static environment with no changes, they tend to reproduce asexually. If you grow them in an environment that's changing, they tend to reproduce sexually. There are certain organisms that have very, very closely related sister species, and one is sexual and the other is asexual. And if you compete them in a static environment, the asexual organism tends to outcompete the other one. If you compete them in a dynamic environment, the sexually reproducing organism tends to outcompete the asexually reproducing organism. Many sexually reproducing organisms have reproductive cycles, meaning females are not always ovulating. And we're familiar with this in terms of the menstrual cycle. So female humans ovulate once a month, essentially. But other organisms release them seasonally, right? A lot of organisms will reproduce in the spring or the summer. Some of them reproduce at certain times of day. Some of them reproduce when the weather gets warm enough or when the light of the day is long enough, rather than having short days. There are lots of different cues that can cause an organism to begin ovulating in the reproductive cycle. And a lot of organisms can reproduce sexually or asexually depending on conditions, as I mentioned earlier. A lot of rotifers can reproduce asexually, but can still reproduce sexually. Some fish can reproduce via parthenogenesis, just like rotifers. Some organisms bud, like jellyfish, like hydras, but also can reproduce sexually. Some organisms get around the difficulty of finding a mate, which is one of the troubles of sexual reproduction, by being a hermaphrodite. And this doubles the number of organisms of their own species that they can mate with, right? If you're male and female, you can create offspring with any of your conspecific individuals. Some hermaphrodites can even self-fertilize, although that's less common in animals, more common in plants. In some species, sex determination, whether an egg will grow up to be a male or a female, depends on the frequency of sex in the population currently. If there are a lot of females, they might grow males. If there are a lot of males, they might grow females. And sometimes you can control that by environmental characteristics like the temperature of the nest, for instance. Some species undergo sex reversals, either in response to an imbalance of sex ratio, or they just naturally, over the course of their lifespan, start off as male and then become female, or vice versa. That's pretty common. The union of two haploid gametes, a sperm and an egg, into a diploid zygote is called fertilization, and this can happen in a number of ways. It can happen externally, where females shed unfertilized eggs, and then male sperm will find them and inseminate them in the external environment. This is particularly common in the ocean. We talked about sponges who do this. A lot of organisms do it this way. But in other organisms, especially terrestrial organisms who have to worry about drying out, for instance, internal fertilization is a different way to do it, in which sperm are deposited into the female reproductive tract, and then fertilization occurs within that reproductive tract rather than in the external environment. And this requires a whole new set of copulatory organs, but you guys are probably familiar with this kind of fertilization because this is what humans do. Now, this can be trickier because you don't just release your gametes and let it be, right? There's courtship behavior involved. You have to get pretty close to the individual of the opposite sex, and there has to be some sort of copulation. And this obviously can be complicated in humans, but it's complicated in all kinds of organisms. If you're a male spider, you are in danger of being eaten by the female that you're trying to court. And so there are a lot of complexities that go along with this. But while internal fertilization has its downsides, it also has its advantages. Namely, a higher fraction of the zygotes survive when they're protected within the parent's uterus. And after fertilization, some organisms lay eggs. They'll drop the embryo in an egg that'll live outside of the mother's body. Some of them will retain the embryo inside the female, like humans do. And often this leads to parental care, which is expensive energetically and an opportunity cost, but it does allow more of your offspring to survive generally. We tend to think of parental care as a given because humans have a very, very high level of parental care. But a lot of organisms have essentially zero once the eggs are laid. They just let them go, move on, and hope for the best. Carrying eggs on your back is an example of parental care because you're protecting those eggs. A lot of wolf spiders do this, and even after the spiderlings are born, they ride around on their mom's back for another week or two, and they have little stretches of spider silk that are attached to hairs on the mother's body, and as they get older, they begin to wander off of her back to explore, but when danger comes by, she will stiffen those hairs, and they come running back to be safe on the back of the mother spider. But whether you fertilize externally or internally, in order to reproduce sexually, you have to produce gametes. And typically the way you do that is you have an organ that produces those gametes, and we call those organs gonads. The male gonads that we're familiar with are testes, and they produce sperm. The female gonads that we're familiar with we call ovaries, and they produce ova, or eggs. And very often elaborate systems of tubes and accessory organs which secrete fluids spring up around this to help facilitate fertilization and also to nourish and take care of a developing embryo afterward. Here's a look at the kind of things that spring up in fruit flies around the testis and ovaries. And in females, this often includes a spermatheca. So female fruit flies have a spermatheca where they can store sperm after they mate with a male. So that maybe they mate with a male and they think he's okay, right? So they mate with him, but they don't know what kind of other options they're going to get. But later they get a better male that presumably has better genes. Then they can compare those two sperm, and they can use the sperm of the male they think is better, either the first or the second male. It's up to the female. Obviously, the males don't like this. They would rather their own sperm be used. So some male organisms, especially arthropods, have evolved ways to combat this, like sperm plugs. So sometimes they will leave a plug to block subsequent males from being able to deposit sperm into a female. Sometimes the plug is the penis itself. They will literally snap off the end of their penis, leave it in the female reproductive tract so other males can't get sperm in there. Reproductive tracts have to have an opening, whether you have internal fertilization, in which case that opening is going to allow sperm to come in, or external fertilization, in which case it's just going to allow you to lay an egg, essentially. You have to have an opening. And a lot of organisms have a common opening between the reproductive, excretory, and digestive systems. So pee-pee, poo-poo, and eggs. And that common opening is called a cloaca. You see this in insects often, in reptiles, and birds. And in most animals, monogamy, which means